Hi, everybody. I'm Chris from Boswell. Today is day 5,795 that Boswell has been in business. Woohoo! Um, this is normally where everyone in the store would be clapping, but right now I'll just clap for it, I suppose. I'm not going to rattle off too many upcoming events, but you can visit our website, and in just a second, I'll drop it into the Insta Live chat there. And I also want to encourage everybody. I'm going to drop a link, and I'll remind you later too. But I do want everybody to buy a copy of Carter Wilson's fantastic new book, Tell Me What You Did. And that is the reason we are all here and streaming this evening. So I'm going to do brief introductions here on the Boswell end and turn it over to Carter and our conversationalist, Patricia, who I'll introduce first. Patricia Skalka, wonderful Wisconsin author of the fabulous Dave Cubiak Mystery Series. We are so glad she's here to ask some questions of our guest for the evening, Carter Wilson. He is the best-selling author of 8 critically acclaimed novels, such as The Dead Girl in 2A and The New Neighbor. He's an ITW Thriller Award finalist. He's a 5-time winner of the Colorado Book Award. His work has been optioned for television and film, screens of all sizes. He is here today with his new novel, Tell Me What You Did. I loved it. It's a page-turning thriller. It's twisty. It's fresh. It's freaky. I think it's really creative, and I think you're really going to enjoy it. So I am going to disappear, and I'm going to turn it over to these two. So Patricia and Carter, thank you so much for being here, and take it away.
Okay, thank you, Chris. And you just used all of the adjectives I wanted to use in talking about the book. I will tell you, it had me on the edge of my chair and kind of looking over my shoulder. And I have to start, Carter, by asking you, do you know like evil people?
That's a great question. And first of all, I just want to say thank you to everyone listening. I'm sorry I'm not there live. If you're in Milwaukee and you're looking outside the window, you can probably understand why. Do I know evil people? I don't think so, but that's the beauty of evil, is it usually doesn't reveal itself very quickly. Fortunately, I can rely on my imagination.
That's what I was thinking. Well, either you come in contact, because there's some deranged folks wandering around in this book, but I'm curious. I was taken with Poe's name, because her name is Dylan Poe Webb. So you have Dylan, and I'm thinking Dylan Thomas, storyteller, and she, of course, is always telling stories or listening to stories. And then Poe, Edgar Allan. And it just struck me that was a great selection, great name for her. And she's a very magnetic character. She has this podcast, and it's an unusual podcast, and you have a podcast. So everyone wants to be on your podcast probably, and everybody wants to be on her podcast. But what's different about hers from all of the true crime podcasts that are out there?
Well, the conceit of her podcast is that rather than, most true crime podcasts you think about, they study a case and they really research it and they kind of tell you what the case is about. This is totally different, where guests can call into her podcast, just any random people. They have to get screened, but then they can anonymously confess to crimes that they claim to have committed. And if Poe believes them, then they stay on the line and they have a conversation about the criminal mind. And it was really, my friend Blake had told me about a podcast a few years ago where people could call in and leave a voicemail and leave an apology. They could apologize to somebody. And I thought that was kind of cool. But I immediately thought, like, what if it wasn't an apology? What if it was a confession? So that's kind of where the impetus for the book came.
And it's, you don't know who's going to walk in the door. Literally, when you do something like that, you could get some really creepy stuff, as she does, and it all flips and turns on her. And in this instance, one of the things is that she seems to be really caught up in the celebrity aspect. Now, she's making her living from running this podcast, so
Right.
She's depending on numbers, viewers and things like that. But that seems to encourage her to maybe be a little edgy and maybe be a little more daring than someone else might be. As a podcaster yourself, do you empathize with that draw of the numbers? Does that really mean something?
Yes and no. I mean, my my numbers are nowhere close to what Poe achieves, because hers is about the number one ranked true crime podcast in the country. But I think that you do, once you find the thing that seems to be working, you lean into it. And for Poe, she is kind of addicted to the numbers, but the reason she started the podcast was almost therapy for herself. She is most comfortable talking to people with a criminal past, that because she's trying to work through her own issues. So I think just the nature of that alone creates this kind of very edgy platform.
Yeah, one of the things about it, because it is a podcast and there's so much of it is dialogue, and it's just beautiful how it flows. It's just,
Oh.
there's enough of the exposition to give you a sense of the place and the setting and the people, but it's just page after page, and I just read through this and I'm thinking, is this all just in your head? Do you say it out loud? How do you handle all of that? That's a lot of conversation.
It's all in my head. And I think the lack of exposition is just my writing style. I'm not big into like describing things. I'm a huge fan of letting the reader kind of have just a nugget of information and then filling in the blanks for themselves. So you won't really find descriptions of my characters in the book, very rarely. Certainly not the protagonist. But yeah, so I don't outline. So I just visualize, okay, here there's two people talking, and I can just kind of hear them talking. And, I'm not going to be so precious as to say like, look, I sit back and I just transcribe. But I think about what they are talking about, and then I think about their individual voices, and then it tends to start flowing. I mean, as as a writer, it gets easier the more you get into the book. Once you have more and more of an idea of like, oh, this is who this person is, and then you usually have to go back to the beginning and kind of, adjust the voice a little bit to what it eventually becomes later in the chapters.
I am so happy to hear you say that, because it's like this light bulb went off in my head at one point in time, that it's like the book has a soul of its own. It has a flow, it has a rhythm, whatever. And that doesn't usually kick in for, and writers sweat over those first few chapters. They want them to be perfect. And my tendency is to say, just tell the story, and then eventually you'll get into that groove, and then you can go back. And that's what you're saying.
You're 100% right. And because I don't outline, it's very easy to sit there and second guess yourself, doubt yourself. And I'm a big believer in like what you just say, tell the story, know that it's buried in your subconscious somewhere, and it's going to come out the more that you write, and know that your first draft is going to be a mess. And those first 3 chapters that you sweat over might not even be in the final manuscript. So just get it down. And then, as you know, the beauty of everything comes alive in the editing. That's where you really have a sense of like the flow and things. And then, it's never done, because give it to your agent, you give it to your editor, and they all have great input. So, it's really a team effort.
I warned you, my cat might show up, and she's right here on the edge of this.
It's quite all right.
You mentioned before that Poe, before a guest is allowed to like really go on with the story, that she screens them, and she's not meeting them in person, and you can see someone, you can't really look in their eyes and have that sense of whether they're telling you the truth or not. In fact, she does see them, because it is a visual thing, but do you think that's possible to do that? Would you know if someone was lying to you, in your podcast, for example?
It's a good question. There are obviously, and people in law enforcement certainly study this. There are a lot of tells a person has when they're lying. There's a lot of very conventional tells, looking down, obviously avoiding eye contact, touching your earlobe. But I think you really have to study that in order to pick up on it. And I think some people have a better innate ability to do with it. And that's what I kind of ascribe to Poe. But I think being removed from the in-person environment and just being online makes it that much more difficult. So personally, no, I would be I'd be a terrible judge if somebody's lying to me or not. But fortunately, Poe is much better than I am.
Yeah, well, you're listening for the story because you're a writer, you
right, right, exactly. Well, and that's just it too. Is like she might accept, for all we know, she might accept people who she thinks aren't telling the truth, but it's a pretty compelling story, right? So it might be worth keeping for the podcast.
So on Halloween Day, Poe is really put in the hot seat. I don't know how much of this you want to give away. Do you want to talk about what happens in the book?
Yeah, I mean, and certainly there's some revelations just on the back cover. But essentially, what happens is, Poe is enjoying this podcast and she's highly successful, and then a guest comes on, and his confession is that he claims to be the murderer of Poe's mother. Now, this is a shock to all listeners because they don't know anything about Poe's history, but Poe obviously knows her mother was in fact murdered. Poe actually witnessed her mother's murder when she was 13. But she knows this can't be the guy because Poe, as she got older, tracked down who she thought was the murderer and killed him. So she doesn't know who this person is. And if he is telling the truth, her dilemma is, who did I kill?
Yeah. Yeah. It's really creepy. And I have to say that the description, the murder scene was really well done. I mean, it was, yeah. And to think, to think how that would affect somebody, especially
Right.
at that young age. And of course, she blamed herself. Why didn't she say something first? And it opens the door to all these layers of what happened, what people, what people did and didn't do, prior to that,
Right.
incident.
Yeah, and I'm interested in the impact of trauma and how it if it's not addressed, how it burrows its way out at some point. Like I said, she started the podcast kind of as therapy. But yeah, she witnessed something terrible. And it was important to me that I didn't just relay that through exposition, like that in her internal monologue, thinking about what happened, that I actually then went back and from a first person present tense perspective, showed what happened, because I think that just lends it a little bit more gravity.
Yeah, yeah, and how it actually just paralyzed her. She wasn't able to do anything for a long time, and she didn't even speak for a long time because she
Right,
was so
right,
traumatized by it.
right, right.
So you said you don't outline, but how do you keep? There are a lot of twists in this book, in this story, and they're terrific. But how do you keep them straight if you're not outlining it to some degree?
Yeah, I think I've tried to outline and I realized over time, like, this is just not how my brain works. And I have such admiration, respect for people who can just see the whole picture and they can outline it. And I've realized that as I write, things reveal themselves to me. And it's almost like the outline's there in my head. I just can't tap into it until I'm physically writing. And so I'm not sitting there thinking like, okay, I really need a twist right about now. It just happens. And sometimes I think of a twist and I'm like, this doesn't quite feel organic. And I ignore it, or I maybe go down that road a little bit and then delete everything. So, it's not a very clean first draft. And a lot of times I don't remember what happened earlier in the story because I haven't gone back and looked at it. So, like I said, it all comes alive in the editing. You sit down and you have to really, as you have to really pay attention. You can't be lazy in your editing. You have to be fully focused and be willing to make big changes, which is a lot of work, but it's the only way, manuscript can make sense at that point.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting that you use a character from a previous book, and not just the one before, but you go back several books to this Mr. Tender's daughter, and the woman Alice who makes the cameo appearance in this book, and she had been traumatized by something that happened to her. It's kind of parallel to the story of what
Yes.
happened with, well, not the same thing happened, but they were both very traumatized. Why did you do that? Why did you bring her back in?
That's a good question. They're both in New England. And so I was just kind of thinking, almost exactly what you just said. You're writing this book and you start to realize like, oh, her arc is very similar to Alice's in terms of, not really doing a good job of dealing with your trauma until it forces itself onto you later in life. And then it just kind of occurred to me, I'm like, they should probably meet. And what would that be like? And I know, like, and it was a lot of it's just for my own amusement, right? Like, I want to see what Alice is up to. Cause I haven't written anything about Alice in years. And that was definitely a discussion with my editor. Do we leave this in? Is it going to be too isolating? Are people going to feel like they need to have read that book? So I chose to leave it in because I love Alice, but we really try to make it so you don't need to know all of Alice's story to appreciate this. But I love having her in there because I miss her a little bit.
And, I have to say, the Alice story is very similar to something that happened, the Slender Man.
That's what that story is based on.
Okay,
I remember reading that article because that was Wisconsin, right?
It was 20 miles away from where I'm sitting right now.
Oh my goodness. And
Yeah.
so when that happened, and I forget exactly when, I remember reading it
2014.
2014. So I was reading the AP news article online, and I got about 2 paragraphs in and I stopped reading. Once I realized at the part where it said that the victim survived, I stopped reading because all I could think about is, what is this poor kid? What does she look like as an adult? What is her life like? And so I didn't read anything else about the case because I didn't want to be tainted. I didn't want to feel like I was taking advantage of it. But that's the story I wrote, was that happened to Alice as a young girl. What is she like now as a 28-year-old? What is her life like?
Yeah. And that was like 4 years later that your book came out. So that was sitting with you for some time.
Yeah. And I know they made docuseries on it, and I didn't pay attention to any of it because I didn't want to be swayed by it.
Do you get other ideas like that? Is it something you read, something you said your friend Blake had mentioned the one podcast, but how about some of the other things you write about?
Yeah, it's somebody might make a comment. There might be something that I read. And you know that feeling, Patricia, you get when like you hear something or you read something and it kind of gives you goosebumps, and suddenly you think, well, what if it wasn't an apology line? What if it was a confession? Like, that's all it takes. And then I never write those ideas down. And I'm usually in the middle of another book, and I think, okay, if I finish this book 6 months from now and I'm still thinking about this idea that I haven't written down, that means I'm going to write about it. So I think of things that fall by the wayside, but the ones that stick with me, those are the ones that I'm excited to write about.
Do you, well, we'll get to that one later, but the book is different because you have this actual multimedia element running through it. There are so you have the printed work, the printed page, right. Then you have the QR codes, and right. Then at the end you have your acknowledgments are actually a video.
Right.
Is this like, are you breaking new ground in the world of publishing? What led you to do this?
I mean, I can't claim that I am. I don't know of any other book that's done this. My editor certainly wasn't familiar with it. But I remember writing the book, and, Poe, the protagonist, she always records her side of the conversation with her iPhone. And I was writing a pretty harrowing scene, and I kind of thought, I want to see what this looks like, just kind of for my own entertainment. And so I hired an actress who had gotten to know a little bit, and she agreed to do a few scenes for me. I'm like, all you got to do is this is your side of the conversation. You're recording with your own iPhone, so it's not high production value. And she gives me the videos, and I'm like, oh, these are really cool. So then I decided I wanted to do something with it. So I packaged it as evidence, recovered evidence from the Vermont State Police. And I asked my editor, I'm like, hey, can we put QR codes in the book? She's like, sure. And I'm like, cool. And then that's why I decided to do the acknowledgments. I don't know, it was just kind of nice. I would thought, like, sometimes, like, I wouldn't mind like reading a whole book, and if I like the book, hey, I want to see this author talk. I want to see what they look like, and I can scan the acknowledgments and I can just see them talking. And I just thought that would be kind of interesting. Does it mean I'm going to do it again? I have no idea, but for this book, it was kind of fun to do.
Yeah, and it worked. I mean, it fit with the whole the context of the story and everything. Speaking of other books, where are you headed next? You're working on something now. What are you working on?
Yep, always working. I tend to sell one book at a time, so it's not like I have deadlines. But the day that I finish a book, the next day is usually when I start the next one. So I actually have a co-written YA thriller that we're about to go on submission with, and then I just finished another standalone thriller that nobody knows what it's about, not even my agent, but I'll be sending that to her in a few weeks, and hopefully it'll sell.
Do you have any interest in doing a series?
That's a good question. I don't, I certainly I wouldn't say no to that. It's never really, yeah, it's tough, as you know, with the publishing industry. If you're a newer author, you can't just suggest, hey, do you want me to do a series? Because they'll say, well, we don't even know how your one book is going to sell. So you really have to come to them and say, here's 4 books in a series, and hope that they buy it. And I've never written a book where I just felt like I just have to continue this character, because most of my characters are more or less everyday people. Maybe something horrible has happened to them, but they're not cops where they can keep getting cases. So I do tend to have crossover stuff in my books, but nothing that makes you have to read the other one in order to appreciate the one you're currently reading.
Yeah. And you use a lot of different locations. I found that very interesting. And I meant to look up, like, where are you from originally? Because you're in Colorado now, but you've used London, you've used New England, you've got the North Shore of Chicago in one of them,
Yeah.
Colorado in one of them.
Yeah, I grew up in Los Angeles, and then I kind of lived in a lot of different places, and I've been in Colorado for about 25 years or so. But I love places that I don't know anything about. And so sometimes I'll make up a city, but Burlington, Vermont, where Tell Me What You Did is set, I've never been there. I've been to Vermont, but I've never been to Burlington. And that's exciting to me, to like explore digitally these places. And it's just something different. I don't like to write what I know.
Okay. And so the next book, where is it set, if you want to tell us?
So the next book is actually set in Colorado, up in the mountains, in a tiny little fictitious town of about 300 people, and the whole story takes place in about 5 hours. So it's a thriller for sure.
Yeah. I like the way, I'm going to go back to Tell Me What You Did. I really liked the way it ended, and that's what I kept thinking, where's this going? Where's this going? And how is he going to end this? Because you have to know, I mean, she's really put on the spot, right?
Right.
And I'm not going to give away anything here, but it just seemed to really work. I mean, she had to come to face the truth of her life,
Right.
and what had happened to her and what she did. But other people were very much affected too. That ending is very traumatic for her and for several other characters in the book too. But they all kind of reach a peace with it.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of that. And as you know, endings they're a crapshoot. Like you don't know, and most people don't like endings. They are always disappointed, and so you just have to write what feels natural to yourself. And I'm a big believer in the realism of consequences, and nothing is less interesting to me than a protagonist who's heroic and they live happily ever after. And you mentioned it, Poe has to deal with the consequences. Even though she's a victim, she's also a perpetrator. And you don't get off scot-free. And I think that's really, so I wrote that ending that I just felt like, yeah, I could see this happening. This feels real to me. But again, you never know how it's going to be received. And I've had endings where people like don't like it because it's too vague or whatever. So you just hope for the best. So I'm glad it resonated with you.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And what about, are you getting that kind of positive response from readers now?
I am. Yeah, I will say I probably feel like there's more positive comments on this ending than most of my other books. So, and you try to crack the formula of like, why is this book taking off, and why didn't my last book take off? And you start to analyze it, and you're like, I don't know. I just don't know. So the key for me is just to write for myself, to write from a place of joy, and discovery and hope.
I am curious to see if there are going to be any podcasts spawned from this, that are going to be, tell us what you did, what is
Yeah.
your confession? Who did you hurt? Or,
That would be pretty cool, I have to admit.
yeah, that would be, I don't know if it'd be cool or creepy, but
Yeah.
maybe a combination too.
Yeah.
So you don't outline, but how much do you work every day?
I only write an hour a day. Because I've got a lot of stuff going on. But that's what I've done for the past 22 years. I used to have a full-time corporate job, so that was kind of the necessity of it. But it's how I work now, but I do it every day. It's really a 7-day-a-week job. And an hour a day, 7 days a week, I can get a draft done in like 6 months. And then, a month and a half of editing or whatnot. So I'm a book a year kind of a person. But I'm also a big believer in not forcing the story. And I feel like if I spent 4 or 5 hours a day writing, I think I would be forcing the story. I would just be trying to get the words in. Just again, because that's how my brain works. I know I have friends who write 8 hours a day and they're brilliant and that's what works for them.
Yeah, this is a hope springs eternal question. You said you were you had a corporate job and now you're a successful author. What was your corporate job?
So I went to hotel school. So I've worked within the hospitality industry for decades, consulting, very data focused kind of a thing, a lot of public speaking. And I actually still do that. I have my own consultancy with a partner of mine in that space, but I also have my own writing company where I do coaching and retreats, and then the writing of the book. So it's tough to make a living just writing novels. It's really tough. So you have to find other avenues to help supplement the income and find things that make you happy doing it.
But you've done a great job of pulling all that together. And there are so many people out there, writers who are struggling and trying to figure out how to find that balance. And I think you're a wonderful example of doing it.
Oh, well, thank you. I failed a lot. But I have learned over the years that if writing is truly what you want to do, and if it's really a passion, you can figure out how to do that work-life balance. And when people hear I only write an hour a day, they're like incredulous. And I'm like, well, that's really all you should write 15 minutes a day, like whatever it takes but do it every day and get into that rhythm. And then you can kind of build on that, but it doesn't take much. It just takes the dedication.
Yeah. Yeah. People get overwhelmed by, the numbers of words and how I can't. And I say, well, how many can you write a day and divide that into the total number? And that's how many days you're going to need, if that's all you can do. So It's the same concept, but
yeah, when I'm actively drafting, I'm 500 words a day and that's pretty much it.
But they're good words, aren't they?
I hope so. I try to make them good words, but again, when in the editing, I usually go and cut out a lot of them.
Well, yeah, that's the nature of the beast, I guess. Well, this has been fantastic. Do you have anything else you want to tell the listening and viewing audience about anything else that's coming up?
Not about anything coming up, just my heartfelt appreciation for anyone watching this. And, and again, apologies, I couldn't be there in person. And I'm very much looking forward to getting out and checking out Boswell and meeting you in person, Patricia, hopefully in the not too distant future.
It may be in the spring of it, sometime.
Yeah, we'll try to get a release date that's a little bit more weather friendly.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know if Chris is going to come back in with questions or not. No. Yes.
Hey guys.
Hey, Chris.
So thank you both so much. This has been fantastic. Don't have a lot of audience questions, but that means I get to ask my question about the book because I really love the book. So I'm going to ask you one more. I'm going to ask you 2 questions from the bookstore, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, of course.
And then if anybody else, while you're out there in internet land, has a question, you want to drop it in the chat right now. We do have a little bit of lag, but we can see if I can get it in. And I did, just so you know, just drop a link to purchase a copy of Tell Me What You Did out there. But our bookstore question for you, Carter, what are you reading and what are you excited about too? I think that's
a good question.
For us.
It's always a question that makes me nervous because I feel like such a fraud when it comes to reading because I was never a big reader until, my late 20s probably. And actually what I tend to read is I read a lot of of nonfiction. I just, and forgive me because I'm not going to remember the author's name, but I just read a book called The Wager, which is a phenomenal book about a
David
ship.
Grand. Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you.
short.
Right. Thank you. It's, of course you would know. Fantastic, fantastic book. And I will, and so I do get an opportunity to blurb different books. And so a buddy of mine, Mark Stevens, just wrote a book, which of course I'm going to forget the name of, but it's coming out in April. And it's a wonderful thriller. So if you Google Mark Stevens, you will find that. But that's about it.
All right, I love it. Somebody did drop in a question here in the chat. They want to know, at what point did you realize that you'd created a total page turner?
You never know. Like as a writer, and Patricia, I'm sure you can attest to this. You finish a book and you almost kind of don't even like it by the time you're done with it because you've been with it for so long. And I know that I've gotten really good at pacing. That's one thing that I've done over the years. Again, this is my 10th book, so I've failed a lot along the way. But I will say, just starting with the publisher, I know I could sense more excitement than what I was necessarily used to. And then when you start getting those early Goodreads reviews, like, months before launch, I started to sense like, okay, something different is happening with this book in a good way. So it's been a fun ride.